Hello and welcome to this episode of the Superhero Ethics Podcast. I'm Matthew. I'm joined by my regular co-host Riki, and today we're talking about Gundam. Gundam is, for those of you who have probably at least heard about it in some way, those who may know it very well, a long-running anime franchise that has had many different brands and video games and anime shows, and most recently had a anime that came to Netflix, where I think similar to one of the ones we talked about recently, we're similar, I think, to Terminator Zero. Excuse me. We're similar, I believe, to Terminator Zero. This was recorded with the intention of having an English and a Japanese speaking cast. And so I watched the English version. Riki, I think you watched the Japanese language version, but we'll talk more about that. And we wanted to talk about it today through a couple of lenses. Gundam is something that has come up a number of times when Riki are talking. We've talked about the mecha anime. We've talked about the mecha anime genre, and this is by many people considered to be the first and often kind of like the dominant one out there. Certainly that shaped a lot of what became to known as the genre. We've been having conversations a lot about the way fascism can play into stories of superheroes, and anime being one particular area where that can come up. And Riki had said this was a good one to watch. And then kind of a related issue, the way that Germans and Germany are often portrayed in anime is one that sort of I've been interested to talk more about with Riki because I've seen it a lot and not exactly sure what it means, had some thoughts, and we'd suggested that this one might be kind of part of that conversation. I think that though that and the fascism may wind up being their own episodes, and maybe we just kind of dip our toes into them today as part of talking about Gundam. But I wanted to kind of frame what we're going to be talking about today. Particularly because I know this most recent show is one that has sparked a lot of conversation, a lot of controversy, with a lot of people really not liking it for a lot of reasons I can really understand. I am someone who, Riki definitely being one of them, I am someone who, this was my introduction to Gundam. I'd actually asked Riki what he thinks I should have watched first, and he suggested I watch this one because, while obviously the story fits into a larger narrative that I'm going to learn about today, I watched it going in knowing nothing, and I found it a complete story, and I didn't find myself, like, there's a lot that I didn't know, but I think the show kind of intentionally takes advantage of that. So we're going to talk first about the show itself, because I think a lot of people, this is just the only one they've watched. And then we are going to talk about it in the larger context. So if you're listening to me talk about what I know just from the show, and you're like, wait, no, but don't you know the larger context? I promise you we will get to that. And on here in Superhero Ethics, we're mostly concerned with the ethical choices, the moral choices, the messaging of a show, and it's who is the protagonist, and what is their point of view, and why are they fighting, and all that. We're not really as interested in the artistry of the shows, but it is an issue that has come up quite a lot, and I think is going to illustrate a very interesting difference between Riki and I. So, Riki, let me first ask, what do you think of the animation in the show?
I hated it.
Yeah.
So I want to address a couple of points. First, I actually didn't watch the Japanese language version. It defaulted to playing in English, and I didn't really think of it. But I also think that's fine, because this is not something that was like most anime. It was not something that was recorded and like drawn for Japanese and then translated.
Right.
I don't know what the process was, but it does seem like it was we'll animate it generically. Like I didn't pay too much attention to the lip movement and such, so I'm not sure, but it does seem like it was just like, yeah, we're gonna make this in Japanese and English at the very least. Gundam in general, I think it's considered the longest running anime franchise or mecha franchise, one or both. And it started the like real robot anime genre. Prior to Gundam, there was what's called super robots, which is a little bit more like Power Ranger style, like fighting against monsters, and there's no like mechanical realism to the robots, and in fact they're often not robots, they're just like beings that are robotic sometimes.
And you can listen to our discussion of Neon Genesis Evangelion for a long conversation.
Well, that's after Gundam and is a separate newer thing. Gundam specifically like started this we want to think about robots realistically in like how they would be used in military, and it is very beloved because of that, because it started this whole genre, and you can really feel the realism
Mm-hmm.
in much of the Gundam franchise, and that's one of the reasons I love it, is that I kind of consider myself a Gundam historian. In that
Mm.
I've obsessed over the franchise so much that I like know all the dates, I know the people and like the treaties, and it very much like the what is called the universal century, Uchuseki
Mm-hmm.
in Japanese, is the main Gundam canon timeline, and then there's a bunch of like alternate, like the way Marvel does 616 and then other ones.
Right.
The universal century is the one I love the most and consider myself a historian of. Like I live and breathe this stuff. So
Mm-hmm.
coming back to this Gundam Requiem for Vengeance, you asked about the animation.
Yeah.
It's I just think it's bad. It's like
Yeah.
very bad 2000s video game animation. And in fact, it was made on the Unreal Engine, which I think
Mm-hmm.
has started out as like video game animation engine.
Yeah.
And you can just see it. Like it's just cheap in a way that like characters don't move realistically, like they clip into like their arms clip into their sides and stuff, and all these kinds of problems that for a video game, like you often don't care. Like you
Right.
see it in video games, it's like whatever. For an animated TV series, I don't like it at all. Like I think it's a problem that they
Mm-hmm.
use this. Either it needs to get better or they need to not do this, in my opinion.
Yeah.
The other thing about the animation, I just like the faces
Mm-hmm.
were like weirdly glowing and slick. It like seemed like they always had a sheen of sweat. And yeah, like they were in stressful situations and sweaty, but
Yeah.
it didn't seem like a realistic sweat sheen.
Yeah, I think the video game description is very apt. They felt to me very it felt to me very much like a long video game cutscene.
Yeah.
Is the
I
best
mean
way
it
to
was
describe
like
it.
the Unreal Engine is like for video
Hmm.
games. So it's
And
interesting that they're using it for television. And
right,
I don't want like I don't want this to be like the animators suck.
yeah,
Right? Like they're doing a job and they were told to work with this technology and they did it. I just think the technology is not up to like a television standards of animation.
I think all of that is completely legitimate. And what I'm about to say has nothing to do with the discussion of the artistry of it. And I can completely understand why people who love anime and love animation hated this. I thought it looked weird. And it's far and away the easiest to understand anime I've ever seen. And for that, I loved it.
Hmm.
One of my biggest frustrations, you talked about like the artistry of the battles in Neon Genesis Evangelion. I
Mhm.
just didn't understand what was going on. I didn't have a sense of what robot was where and who was attacking what and what was happening because it was done in this very impressionistic artistic style. And it may well be just like my brain. I've always had a brain that doesn't really grok art in a physical way. Like I looked at the Mona Lisa and I was like, it's a woman smiling. I don't get why it became the thing it became. And
The
again, I think that is
Mona
my
Lisa is overrated.
well, that's
Sorry.
possible too.
I mean, it became what it became. Like I think it is a good piece of art, but largely like because it was stolen, it got a lot of notoriety.
Oh, that's possible. Yeah, I don't want to get in that tangent. I just mean as an example of people will look at art and tell me all the things they see in it. And I don't doubt them. I don't think they're wrong. I just don't see it. And so for me, this felt like someone saying, we want to do animation because it's a lot cheaper and easier, especially with all the crazy special effects we're doing. But we're just going to try and make it as close to reality as we can with the animation technology that we have right now or that we can afford. And again, I don't know if it's because I just don't have an artistic mind or maybe because I didn't grow up watching anime. Like I haven't seen most of it. So I just haven't kind of learned the artistic language of the genre. But for whatever it is, I loved it because it kind of said to me, you don't have to worry about it. This is just the story is the story. And I really loved the story of this because really, and I'll give a summary of it in a bit, but it's really this idea of like starting from the perspective of these soldiers and their desire for vengeance in a defeated situation, and are they going to survive? And like, it really does some great things, I think, with playing with, is the protagonist necessarily the hero, and drawing the camera back on that. And for me, because I didn't have to think about what is the intention, what's the meaning of the art, it was just like, here's where this robot is, here's where that robot is, so you understand why they're saying these things that they're saying. I loved it.
So
Which again, totally not what other people like, and that's fine. But
well, okay, I agree with you that the mobile suit fights in this they were the best part of the animation. And I also want to kind of broaden the scope that in Gundam, like I already said, it's more realistic, like treating them as real weapons of war. The time period that this story takes place in is during the first Gundam,
Right.
the original series, and that is also when the Gundams were the least technologically advanced, and so they're more grounded. Like when you get to future Gundams, they fly around faster and like do all of the anime things and like spinning and stuff.
Right.
In this one, technologically they are walking tanks, right? And this Requiem for Vengeance specifically, like taking place on Earth, like because part of the story fighting takes place in space. They're like, even like they do fly in space, but here like they kind of like do rocket jumps.
Yeah, exactly.
And so the movement of the fighting is all like much more grounded.
Yeah,
literally.
Yeah, and it felt a lot more realistic in that kind of a way. And I think there's good and bad parts to that for sure that we'll talk about. So with that, let's talk about the story itself. And again, I know that there's a much larger story. I'm going to give my understanding of the story, and let's talk about the story itself, and then talk about it in larger context. So we open with this group of people who are, hold on, I want to make sure I get the names exactly right here. Come on, stop. This group who is piloting a bunch of mobile suits that at first I thought were going to be Gundams, but I learned they were called Zaku's. And they're doing this on behalf of this group from outer space who it's described as the Revolutionary War, and they're fighting a rebellion, as they say, for their independence. And they're all people from space fighting against Earth's domination, but they're doing it. Most of this battle takes place in southeastern Europe, primarily in Romania, and then moving southeast towards Russia and the final exit point in Odessa. And immediately, part of me was thinking, like, the American Revolution didn't invade England in order to get its freedom. Like, there's something off here about a group that's all about how we're fighting for our own freedom, but we're also here fighting on Earth. We're invading Earth. And I thought that was really interesting. But it's about this group of pilots, and they fight some battles, and then quickly into the battle is inserted a mecha that is far more powerful and far more technologically advanced than theirs. And this is what they describe as a Gundam. And which kind of threw me a little. I was like, oh, that's interesting. And they're fighting against the Gundam, and the Gundam is kicking their ass. And then they're kind of looking for survival. And they have this whole plot line about rebuilding 2 new Zekas of the, their kind of version of the mecha suits. And there's interesting dynamics there, but they get these 2 built, and they learn that not only does this other side, the enemy, the Federation, or the EFF as it's referred to, have this one hugely impressive Gundam, they also have these other things called GMs or GIMs, which are
it's weird. It's spelled GM. It's just pronounced Jim.
Yeah, GM or gem. And so the GIMs are not quite Gundams, but are certainly much more powerful than the that our heroes' mechas. There's more fighting. They're able to take down the GIM, but still can't stand up to the Gundam, and a lot of their friends die. And there's a lot of talk about how our primary protagonist, a woman named Iria Solari, and her kind of buddy and second in command, Lieutenant LaShawn, that they are just filled with anger and sadness and grief about the loss of all of their friends. And at one point, LaShawn almost is going to kill the helpless pilot when he escapes the gym that they've destroyed, and she gets him to stop. And then there's a doctor character, and there's a lot of discussions about, like, is there room for mercy in this world of battle, and what's the role of vengeance and things like that. And our captain, our protagonist, seems to be mostly against the idea of vengeance. We then decide that the best way that we can kind of survive dealing with this Gundam is to steal one of the gyms, because then at least we can understand the gym technology, because there's only one Gundam, but they're mass producing these gyms. And the thought is that if they can steal one, then they can kind of, build their own, but also understand it, study it, find its weaknesses, hopefully find the weakness of the Gundam, and take them all down. And they try to do that. It fails. As part of doing that, they infiltrate the enemy base, and there's a kid hanging out with the enemy soldiers. And that kid has a moment with Solari, where he basically finds a watch that she has that's marked with the symbols of the rebellion. What was the name of them? The Zeons, as they're called, who again have been presented to us as the protagonist, but at least as I understood, the show's doing a very interesting thing of kind of making you doubt their own things they believe. And and kind of related to this, they've been at sorry, back that up. And so they have this kind of moment of connection where he maybe figures out that she's a spy, but kind of doesn't turn them in, or maybe he just like suspects it, but they have a moment of real human connection. She has a son back home that she's incredibly worried about and sees the son in him. Get to the last episode where everyone's trying to scramble to Odessa, because basically they're deciding that this invasion of Earth has not worked, at least here in this sector, Europe and Asia, and they're all retreating back into space through the port of Odessa. And we get one more big battle where she realizes that it's that kid who's piloting the Gundam, which for me was another that's where I started to get a clue of like what the larger story might be. But I'll get into that. I want to just talk about this story itself. She starts to really have empathy for him and have a conversation with him. Well, because she has decided that she is going to sacrifice herself, basically go on a kind of suicide mission so that she can let everyone else escape. And she maybe can escape, but probably she's just going to die with honor, because in her words, everyone else has died for her. And in some cases, quite literally, like LaShawn, he and his mecha leap in front of her for a death blow that would have destroyed her. That's weighing on her mind. She has these dreams where she sees all the people who died under her command. But then during the fight with the Gundam, she starts talking to the kid who's the pilot and trying to get the kid to realize that this fight is pointless. As she's saying, like, we just want to go back home. And he's saying, you all are terrorists. You invited us. If we don't kill you, how do we know you're not going to do it again? And she kind of just doesn't even get into that. She's saying, no, just let us go. Let us go. He has a chance to deliver a death blow. He doesn't. He kind of saves her life. And then as she's kind of like getting up to thank him and keep talking, another one of the Zeon mechas finds them in this position where that Gundam is now kind of defenseless and destroys it, killing the kid. And she's kind of horrified and outraged about it. And then we get to this epilogue, which from what I've read is very controversial, and I have some thoughts on it, where she basically says that the Zeons have all left Europe and Asia, that the only real fighting left is in Africa, where it's basically kind of the remnants of all these other groups that are left there. They're called the remnants. And that mostly they're just out for vengeance, and mostly they're just fighting to avenge those who have died. And she had been right up to the killing of that kid very much like, maybe we shouldn't fight to protect the kids. And she gives this speech, which is fundamentally contradictory, because she said, part of what she realizes is she's horrified that the war has gotten to the point that kids are being forced to fight and that there's child soldiers. but she can't make the leap of realizing that it's kind of like that her side continuing the war is part of what's forcing that to happen. She's like, no, this side is using child soldiers. That has to stop. So we need to destroy all of them, which means just continuing to fight against the child soldiers. And that's where it ends. And it was one of those things where I was like, either the writers are utterly brilliant and are really asking the audience to do their own work in recognizing that the protagonist is not the good guy here and that it's much more complicated than the protagonist thinks, or it's incredibly bad writing that doesn't realize all the way it's self-contradictory. And I chose to believe it's more of the first. But yeah, so just sticking with the story itself,
disagree.
Yeah. Tell me what you think.
And I just want to, that was a good summary. I want to add part of her Solari's motivation in all this and her mentality is because kind of eye rolly, she's a mother and she left a kid back home in space in Xeon.
Yeah.
And the pocket watch she's carrying is like her item of memory, right? Of him. And I think before the final battle, she gives the watch to the mechanic who she was friends with prior to joining up and says, give this to my son.
Yeah.
Like when you get back to space.
And I would also say, so she has that mother part, which I agree with you is a little cliche and eye rolly or a lot cliche. She also has a dead husband who died in other fighting quite recently. And I think that's, for me, I saw that as kind of the two sides that were pulling on her was do you seek vengeance for the dead or do you seek to protect the ones who are still alive?
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Where do you want to start?
Well, I guess,
this. Because I'm
so
ready.
It seems like you had a different take and perhaps don't give the writers quite as much credit as I do. So
here's my problem. Gundam, like I said, especially Universal Century, has a vast history. Like there's a lot of material, and similar to like a Star Wars or a Marvel thing, like there's canon. And if you choose to play in this sandbox, you have to acknowledge and appreciate the canon.
Right.
I think with something like Marvel, it's more complicated because they reset timelines and different writers and they change stuff. You see stuff is much tighter, in my opinion. I think it's more similar to Star Wars than to, especially like Disney Star Wars, where they kind of reset and said, now, like we've created our sandbox, like we got to stick to it.
Right. Yeah. So tell us more about the larger context that the story takes place in.
Well, I mean, the 1 minute history of the 1 year war is that yes, there are space colonies, and then there's Earth, and it's all humans. There's no aliens. The space colonies feel oppressed by the Earth Federation government. Basically, like they were forced to move off of Earth. Like there's this whole ecological aspect of it where like, like we are now, it's like Earth is suffering because of humanity. So we're just going to offload a bunch of humans to space colonies and let the Earth heal. Right. But the living conditions on the space colonies are not great because they're space colonies. And so like there's an oppression and a kind of forced relocation aspect to all of it. One of the colonies, Side 3, rebels against the Federation, and they declare themselves the Principality of Xeon.
Okay.
And they begin this war that is historically called the 1 year war. And they have a technological advantage in that they were the first to develop mobile suits, specifically the Zaku. And then they mass produced them and kind of overwhelmed the Federation with this technology. And where the original series starts is that the Federation has finally developed their own mobile suit, the Gundam. And it has taken like all of their study of the Zaku and created like this even better model. So like the Gundam is like vastly superior. And specifically that we see in this one is that it uses beam weapon technology. Like all of the Zaku fight with conventional like machine guns and grenades and stuff. Whereas the Gundam has like such a powerful engine, I guess, that it is able to use that to charge a beam cannon rifle. And that's just like overwhelmingly powerful, as we see in this show. So the Gundam like turns the tide of the war, and of course the Federation starts developing the gyms as well that also can use beam weapons.
Mhm.
Um, and they defeat Xeon. And in the original series, the Gundam is the protagonist, right? It's
Right.
piloted by the a kid. You know, we'll get into the kid aspect, who is the protagonist of the show, Amuro Day. He's the hero,
Mhm.
and so it's all told from like his perspective and his struggles. And so first off, like this show just flips that, right?
Right.
But where the Xeon group, Solari, is unquestionably the protagonist.
Mhm.
I'm never gonna call her the hero
Yep.
because of Gundam history, which we'll get more into. But I did think it was interesting, especially in the first episode, the way that I'm gonna say the word film, the way that they film the Gundam had such a terrifying like horror movie vibe. The
Mhm.
way that it stalked them through the forest and was like, even though its paint scheme is white,
Yeah.
it was like in darkness and like barely like backlit by the moonlight, and
Mhm.
it had such a menace. So I liked that aspect of it, like
Yeah.
because even in the original series, the Xeon enemies would call the Gundam the White Devil, and they were afraid of it because it was like just so powerful. They're like, how do we
Yeah.
defeat this thing?
So in the original, because from the story you just told, it sounds like oppressed colonies fighting against the empire. I'm going to be on the side of the oppressed colonies.
Hmm.
But it sounds like in Gundam, the original, we are on the side of the Federation. How do they justify that? Is it about the fact that Xeon is no longer just fighting for its own freedom, that now it's invading Earth and kind of
Well, here's where we get into some war criming.
okay?
In the prehistory, like before the Gundam series started, Xeon forces used poison gas to wipe out the population of another space colony. So I think it was
Mhm.
basically like a space colony that was like, no, we don't want to be a part of your rebellion, because it
Right.
wasn't like a unified space colony thing. Like it started with Side 3.
Right.
Side is just like the names of the colonies that they get
Mhm.
with numbers. Started with Side 3, and I believe Side 4 said that they were going to be neutral.
Mhm.
And so the Xeon forces attacked Side 4, gassed the entire population of the colony, and then used the husk of the colony, because these are like multiple mile long things, right, where people
Mhm.
live. They are cylindrical, and they rotate to provide the illusion of day night. Like they rotate and have like open and closed panels that let sunlight in.
Oh, so they're just floating. This isn't like a colony on a moon of Jupiter.
No, okay, yeah,
It's
sorry, yeah, of
floating in
course
space.
you wouldn't know that. I apologize.
Yeah.
Yeah, they are space stations. Yeah, but
Yeah.
they're
Okay.
huge, and so they gas Side 4. I think
Mhm.
it's 4. You know,
Yeah.
write in and correct me if I'm wrong on this. And then they use the husk of this multi-mile long space colony, and they drop it on Earth.
Mm.
They do a colony drop. It is a horrific, you know, terrorist action
Right.
that they were aiming for Jaburo, which is in South America. It was the Federation's like primary military base on Earth,
Mhm.
and because physics is complicated and stuff, they miss, and it hits Australia.
Mhm.
And so in the Gundam world, Southeast Australia, you know, like Canberra, Sydney, etc.,
Right.
there's a massive crater. There's just like one, I'd say 1/10 of Australia is like carved out, and
Right.
there's just a crater. And of course, like millions of people died in that
Right.
colony drop, in addition to potentially millions in the gassing. So that's what Xeon did.
Right.
And I'm just like, there's no, you can't, again, like if you're going to play in the universal century, you can't get around that.
Mhm.
um and then later in the war, the Xeon forces use a colony laser, which
Mhm.
again, like I think they killed all of the inhabitants of this colony, and then modified the cylinder to be a massive laser barrel,
Mm,
and fired it on the Federation fleet. Which that is a little more like, okay, like it's a military action. You're not
right,
firing on civilians, but it's like another mass weapon of mass destruction that they're
right.
using. So that's like a aspect of Xeon, is that they don't care. Like
Yeah.
they will use whatever means necessary. Um and I guess I'll mention this now. There is a there's a whole race aspect to all of this in
Mm-hmm.
Gundam. It's very complicated, but like traditionally, it's not something we think of as race in
Right.
terms of, black, white, Asian, etc. It is space no they call them space noid. I think they actually use this term in this show. Space
Okay, yeah.
noid versus earth noid. And
Mm-hmm.
specifically space noids, because they live in space, some of them have started to evolve and gain like these weird psychic powers. And they're
Right.
called new types, which I also believe they mention in the show.
Yep.
Like they're like, she might be a new type because she's got this weird like sixth sense, right?
Yeah, and she senses that a Gundam is coming to attack them
Yeah.
long before it actually happens.
Because undoubtedly the pilot of the Gundam is also a new type, and on these shows, new types often have like this connection where they can sense, like the
Yeah.
force, like a presence I haven't sensed in
Yeah.
years. So they can sense each other. And the thing with new types is like it is a different race. They call it an evolution, right? But it's similar to I would call it similar to mutants in
Right.
X-Men, where humanity is taking the step and evolving, and now there's this conflict between mutants, Homo superior and Homo sapien. In Gundam, the conflict is between space noids and earth noids, and many of the space noids are evolving into new types.
Right.
And some of them, just like in Magneto, consider themselves superior,
Right.
and that we have to wipe out the earth noids
Right. They're
and
gonna always
help
come to us, and we're better than them anyway, so we need
and
to
help
right.
humanity to evolve to its next stage. So I a lot of people in the Gundam fandom
Mhm.
complain that like, oh, like this, like it's not racist. It absolutely is. Like it's just
Yeah.
not race in the traditional sense that you think of it. But you can call it an allegory, but I think it is like, if this were real, it absolutely would be a racist thing to say like space
Right.
noids slash new types are superior to earth noids, and hence like we're gonna wipe them out. Like
Right.
that's genocide.
Yeah. 100%. Well, and I thought that I was curious about the role race played in this because I did know going into this that you had said one of the things to kind of be on the lookout for is the Germanic aspect, and how that kind of factors in. And um, to me, the Solari and her team and the other Xeons we meet are fairly racially diverse in terms of like their names and their appearances and how that references to Earth races that we know about. The modern day understanding of Earth and race.
Yeah.
Obviously this is set far in the future, but you have Alfie is very clearly black, and um, uh, Erie feels like European of some kind to me. And then the only really kind of explicitly Asian or Japanese character is let me make sure I get the name right.
The doctor.
Dr. Oni Kasuga. Did I get
Kasuga.
Dr. Oni Kasuga. And then and there's one character who is very much kind of like the enemy within. He's the major of commands the base that they go to for repairs and safety. And he's very much like, all I care about is protecting my own. And he wants to like have them leave. He doesn't want them to build the Gundams because he doesn't want to be attacked. He's like very much like kind of portrayed as a coward and a like strict by the rules, hooray for me and mine, and to hell with everyone else. And he seems to me at least very Germanic. He has a kind of fairly German name, as Major Ronit. And I think the first name is also fairly Germanic, but I forget what it is. His uniform looks kind of like grayish in a kind of like very much the World War II German way. But then when we meet the people from the Federation, and granted, we only meet 3 of them, 2 of them are adults and one of them is this kid, they all look basically racially homogenous. Which at first got me wondering, like, wait, are they supposed to be the German stand-in in this? And then later, as I went on and realized more and more, the Zeons are actually probably the Nazi stand-in in this. Was like, oh, okay, I see what we're doing here. But I just thought all of that was pretty interesting, the way they were playing with that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I have not thought deeply about like modern race in Gundam because the original like 1979, I imagine it was very like homogeneously, generically Japanese looking
Right.
people, right? So yes, like I think it's good what they did here to have, like have
Mm-hmm.
black people in Gundams. Like in general, like there needs to be more modern racial representation like this in anime.
Right.
As long as this is a fictional world. Like if it takes place in Japan, I understand like why you would make
Yeah,
it
of
more
course.
homogenous. But it's a completely fictional world, and yeah, like
Mm-hmm.
it's still Earth,
Right.
so black people exist.
Right.
Um, where am I going with this? I don't know. Could
Well,
talk about the Germanic undertones, I guess.
yeah, why don't we do that a bit? And then I want to get back to like the story of this and how it does or doesn't fit into the canon that we're talking about. So let me just kind of lay out what I know here. In Neon Genesis Evangelion, we did a whole episode on it, but I'll give the very brief summary that like it is set specifically in Japan. There's mecha pilots, they're fighting these big bad angels. It's a whole thing. But most of the characters we have are Japanese until this girl is introduced who's kind of an antagonist, kind of a love interest, is very strict about the rules and is very much bullying our hero Shinji. And she is specifically said to be from Germany and has a kind of more German sounding name and is explicitly said to be half German, half Japanese. Also in Full Metal Alchemist, which you haven't seen yet, I believe, and we'll talk about another point, there are very much clearer allusions to Germany and that the big sort of enemy of the empire, like he wants to call himself, I think it's like they're meant to be kind of very Germanic. There's a lot of German imagery, and he calls himself, the word is translated as Führer. And the justification for that is that he's German and he's using the word Führer, which is literally just a German word for leader.
Leader, yeah.
But of course has all the Hitler connotations that and German people, if you had better understanding this right in, my understanding is that for a while at least that word wasn't used as much for leader because of those connotations.
Yeah. Why would you?
Yeah. It's kind of like Adolf used to just be a popular name, and like most German children are not named that anymore. It's why, think of like someone like Dolph Lundgren. A lot of people who'd been born Adolf changed their names to Dolph.
Oh, I hadn't even thought about that.
Or just like people who have like, like if your great great grandfather was named Adolf and you wanted to keep that family tradition,
Yeah.
you didn't want to name, you called him Dolph.
Okay.
But yeah, so talk to me, and again, this will probably be its own episode, but give me the like 5-minute spiel on Germans and German imagery in anime.
In general?
Well, actually, what you see, how, like, what we see in this particular show, Gundam, and how you think it plays the larger narrative that you've mentioned once or twice before that it plays into.
I mean, there's a lot of it. It's uncomfortable. It's hard because you don't know what each individual creator of anime, like why they're making decisions, right?
Right.
Unless you can find interviews and stuff. But my impression overall, like in general on anime, is that like German and like specifically Nazi imagery is used because they're the historical villain, right? For the 20th century, and it's very iconic imagery. Like they had such distinct uniforms and the use of flags and their propaganda and their rallies. And that's very powerful. Like it was powerful in the 30s and 40s, and that's why things happen. And you can use that imagery to portray this kind of power, and in this case, like evil coded power. Like these are the bad guys. Like that's what you say when you use Nazi Germany imagery in something.
Right.
And I also believe that it happens a lot in anime because you can't use Imperial Japanese imagery.
Right.
And I say can't, like you could, like there's no law against it. Like I believe there are laws against it in Germany on
Hmm.
displaying Nazi imagery specifically. But it would raise too many questions, right? If you
Right.
did that in Japan. It's like, oh, like why are you doing this? Even though like the politics of it is very complicated and there are even like modern politicians who try to whitewash history and the
Hmm.
crimes that Japan committed during the World War II and preceding, and long for as many now reactionary governments are doing, long for the glory days of their power.
Right. And
But
just
it's
I think 99% of our listeners already know this and understand it, but just to draw the explicit line, the Imperial Japan you're talking about was not the Nazis by any means, but were the allies of the Nazis in World War II. And so that kind of, I can see the desire of kind of wanting to separate those two by those who kind of want to look back fondly at Imperial Japan.
yeah. So there is like anime and manga in Japan that does use that imagery, but it's usually like explicitly historical.
Mm,
And sometimes it's like historical revision, like what if we had won the war, like what if Admiral Yamamoto, I think Yamamoto Isoroku,
hmm.
died like early in the war, but there's one very popular anime that's like if he had survived we
Right.
would have won because he was such a brilliant military genius type of
Yeah,
thing.
he was the one who planned Pearl Harbor and
Yeah.
some of the other really successful Japanese attacks at the beginning of the American entry into the war.
Yeah, so that exists. Like there is actually a whole genre of this. I forget what it's called, but like a revisionist
Hmm.
fiction in Japan that longs for victory. If you don't want to be that explicit, I think that people just use Nazis, right? Like,
Yeah, I can see that.
and even in Western media, right? Like, even it's historical, but Indiana Jones fights against Nazis because it's like an easy villain, like
Right.
easy villain to code. And so in Gundam, I think the uniforms, very like Nazi. The
Right.
use of the flags, like in this series, I think in episode 2, after they win the battle, the leader of the forces, the Xeon forces, has like a speech in a kind of,
Hmm.
I think like a schoolyard or something like that in the city that they've just taken.
Right.
And they unfurl the Xeon flags behind him over this like 2 or 3 story tall building.
Yeah.
Like 2 big flags, and that is like hugely Nazi coded to have
Hmm.
like flags unfurled like on both sides like that. Like long flags, like drapery type
Right.
flags.
Kind of you think of like Sound of Music, those
Yeah.
long Nazi things that would hang down in buildings. It's very
And
much.
he gives a speech that like a victory speech that is like very, Mein Führer speech.
Hmm.
So yeah, I like, again, like I am biased because I have experienced Gundam and it's like everywhere.
Yeah.
But I'm curious then for your perspective on some of those things. Like, did you notice them? Did you say, huh?
I I think I definitely did. Because like I said, I was watching the whole thing wondering, like, it felt to me like they weren't reliable narrators. And I don't
Mhm.
think I noticed specifically that imagery during the speech felt off. I don't think I remember the flags, but as you say it, I'm kind of seeing it again in my head. But the fact of like they didn't talk about liberating Earth. They talk about how they had to fight Earth in order to to like win the freedom for their homelands or whatever. But then I kept thinking, but then why are you fighting on Earth? Like it sounds like you've already won. What's happening here? And
Yeah.
it, I, it for me, the larger story you told me, and again, maybe I'm giving the authors too much credit here, but it fits perfectly with what I thought the show was saying. Because to me, this is a show that says, let's tell you a story from the perspective of the people who up till now have been the bad guys. And on the one hand, we're showing you that for those individuals, they're humans too. They're people like you. They get upset, they fear, they have love, they have husbands and wives and children and all that. But also, Look at how unreliable narrators they are. Look at how brainwashed they are. For me, this felt like an epic tragedy because
Hmm.
the way that Solari is at the end, she says, I recognize that the war is wrong. I recognize that the war is forcing children to be soldiers. So I have to stop it. And you're like, yes, yes, yes. And then she says, like, and so to do that, I have to fight with the most vengeful filled soldiers to like kill all the Federation people, including all the Federation children, so they stop using children. It feels to me a lot like Kylo Ren's turn, where he is like defeated Snoke, and him and Rey have fought together, and they're like, yes, do the right thing. And now he's like, Rey, you and I can rule as the leaders. And you're like, no, you were so close, but then you went totally the wrong way. That's how I saw it. And so, like, for me, this feels like a brilliant way to introduce me to that larger story. Because now I'm like, okay, now I want to see it from the kid and the Gundam's perspective. Because yes, I understand that like Solari aren't nameless, that Xeon aren't nameless, faceless thugs. They're real people, but they're horribly wrong and they're doing horrible things. And to me, that is really complexifying the story in a way that now makes me really excited to see some of the earlier stuff.
Yeah. I want to specifically address the invasion of Earth aspect of it, because you asked, like, well, if they just want independence, why are they invading Earth? And this is where, some people who try to defend Gundam or Xeon as like, no, it's not Nazis. Like, here are aspects that are pulled from other things,
Right.
right? And yes, like this is fiction, and it's not gonna be 100% Nazi Germany, because if you're gonna do that, why not just make like a historical drama,
Right.
right? So you are creating something new, but you are borrowing aspects from history, and that's
Right.
where like the uniforms and the flags. In terms of this operation on Earth, I feel like the analogy fits much more with what Imperial Japan did. So, like, the colony drop was meant as like intimidation and to put the Federation on the back foot,
Right.
because they targeted the military base. Right? That's a Pearl Harbor analogy right there,
Yeah.
in my opinion. Of like, we strike first, take out their nerve center, and then after that, what Japan did was just conquer a bunch of Southeast Asian nations
Right.
very quickly, and tried to like gather steel, as many resources as they could, and bring them back home to kind of hunker down for the
Yeah.
next phase. And that's what's going on here, is that Xeon attacked the Federation and wiped out a bunch of their forces early on with the superior advantage of the mobile suits, which is also similar to the way, again, like Imperial Japan used fighter jets,
Right.
when prior to that naval battles were very much like battleship centric.
Right.
So it's like we have this new fast hitting like small mobile weapon that can hit hard and like can be, deployed quickly, and we'll take the early advantage. We'll invade Earth in this case and steal and gather up as many resources as possible, and then
Mm.
take them back to our space colonies, and then like deploy these resources and tool up for the next phase of the war.
Well, that
So
really makes.
the
Okay.
so the sorry, I just want to finish
No,
up
please.
the evacuation in Odessa at the end of this series is interesting, because it had like, from this show's perspective, it has like Dunkirk feels,
Yeah.
right? Like, we got to get out of here. But again, like, they are the invaders, so you're
Right.
retreating. You're not like, and the other part is like, a large portion of the Odessa evacuation was
Mm-hmm.
the resources that they gathered up and stole, because this is like close to the Middle East, and like all the oil fields, right? So the
Mm. Okay.
commander in Odessa, I believe, was named Makuve, and he is like super German coded in terms of like his like plundering aspect. Like, I've plundered Earth, including,
Yeah.
I believe, like art as well, in the resource. Like, he's very much like a neo aristocraty character, where
Mm.
he like is like very like, like, I am so like high minded, and now I have all these resources, right? And so that aspect is missing from this. Like, Commander Makabe, and like the
Hmm.
stealing of resources, the plundering of Earth's resources, which I mean it's hard to tell all these stories because again, Gundam is
Right.
huge and there's been so much.
I,
But I
I
just want to add that for you for
yeah.
your context.
No, I think it's super helpful. And there's two things I'd add. One is particularly the connection to Imperial Japan really helps to make sense because it felt like what they kind of talked like they were liberating Earth, but also like they had no interest in Earthlings or anything like that. And part of what I'm reminded of is that during that whole period you're talking about Imperial Japan conquering all of these other nations and taking their resources, which, to be clear, like what they were doing wasn't like some new thing. They were just like, like think about like, the kid looking at the parent and like, I learned it from you. It's exactly what Great Britain and Germany and America and all of the other nations had been doing to the Southeast Asia and other places like that for generations. But there's an irony because, the way Imperial Japan couched it was that they were the Philippines was a protectorate of the American government. And Americans had been slaughtering Filipinos, particularly in the South in Mindanao. And so Japan was liberating the Philippines
Mm-hmm.
and then slaughtered by the tens of thousands Filipinos who didn't want to be liberated. They were
Yeah.
liberating the Chinese from the British, liberating Hong Kong, liberating Singapore, and then practically enslaving people and killing them by the, and so the idea of Zeon kind of seeing themselves in that light makes a lot of sense to me. And I get why, especially if you know all that, you'd want to see it in here. I think for me, the counterpoint is that like I'm really excited learning about that now because it's like, oh, okay, this makes sense. Because I don't believe the individual soldiers think that that's what they're doing. Like, and so the fact, because this feels like the highest rank we ever see is, well, for the most part, we only see captains and majors and lieutenants. At one point, Wolverine shows up and he's a major general.
Yeah.
I didn't really, and I just mean that he's got like the Wolverine like kind of triangle hair. And
I think he might have been a character in one of the
I think
original
he
anime.
was. Yeah, I wrote down his name. Where was it? Major. Okay, I just wrote him down as Major General Wolverine. Sorry, I didn't actually write down his name. He's kind of a ridiculous figure, but he like gives them the mission. But for the most part, we're not dealing with the commander of Odessa. We're dealing with the grunts on the ground.
Mm-hmm.
And so to me, I think there's something really powerful about seeing their perspective and seeing like, no, they don't think of themselves as invaders. They don't think of themselves as plunderers. And it's not to say that they're right. They are very much wrong. But that I kind of love that. I kind of love getting to understand their perspective. And again, this tragic turn of like where they come from, where they wind up going in terms of Solari deciding like, no, I need to keep the fight going in Africa.
Yeah, okay. So let me seg that into explaining the Africa thing.
Yeah.
Because I think that is where a lot of Gundam fans really got upset. Because of the history of the Universal Century and like we know what happens to those people.
Yeah.
So this story takes place in 0079 to 80. Like that's the 1 year war, 79 to 80. And then in 83, a Zeon remnant like starts a new conflict. And part of that conflict involves these Africa troops.
Right.
That they are involved and they steal a nuclear weapon equipped Gundam from the Federation and then use this Africa base to launch it into space. And then the space Zeon remnant forces use the nuke to attack a Federation fleet. And then when they are distracted by that, they drop another colony on Earth. Operation Stardust.
Yeah.
So yeah, like if we are to understand the ending of this show, Captain Solari was holed up in Africa, and then if she's still alive, she participated in this action that involves stealing a nuke and then dropping another colony on Earth. Like she wouldn't have participated in like the planning of the colony drop, but
right.
she contributed to the effort. And that's why it's like, what are you doing? Like, why is it like you're like, we have to stop the fighting, like, for the children, and then yeah, 3 years later you're gonna participate in this. And she, like, what upsets me is her son is still alive
Yeah.
in space. Just like surrender and go be with your son is how
See,
I
and
felt.
I this is where I think this is a real difference. And again, it may just be that I'm ignorant and I don't know the larger context. And if I'd seen all that, I would feel differently. But to me, I 100% believe that the story knows that that's the whole point. Is that because in the story, clearly there were people who did exactly that, and it's easy to think they're just all mindless barbarians and they're all just like. I just did an episode on Star Wars and Rebellion. Don't know why I'm thinking about Rebellion a couple days after the election, but here we are. And one thing we talked about was how, like, when the Nazi the stormtroopers of the Empire are very much supposed to be kind of Nazi stormtroopers, and you never see their faces. They're not people; they're just automatons. Like, not literally, but that's how they're portrayed. And I 100% think Solari is wrong. I 100% agree with you. She should just go back into space and be with her son. But I 100% believe that she would go to Africa and she would participate in these horrible atrocities because in her mind, that's what she has to do to protect kids like her son. And you're right, it is completely contradictory. Everything that the Nazis did was completely contradictory, and yet it did happen. Everything that all these empires do is completely contradictory to the values that they claim to espouse, yet it does happen. And so for me, I guess that's my take on it. And again, I'm not saying you're wrong. You know much more about this than I do. And again, the writers might have just been really bad, and I'm just inventing and kind of headcanoning it all. But to me, you're saying, like, say again?
I just don't buy it. Because it's like an information difference. I think what this show, the ending to me, was trying to portray is that Solari becomes, like, after World War II, there were Japanese soldiers famously, like, stranded on islands in the Pacific.
Yeah, like the last one surrendered in the late 70s or something like that.
Who some of them legitimately did not know that the war had ended. Right? Some of them maybe they knew and just chose to keep fighting, but some of them I believe, like, legitimately did not know the war ended, kept like shooting at people thinking that they were fighting, Americans. And it felt like that's what this show was trying to show, is that she's going to Africa and then, like, is going to keep fighting without really knowing what's going on. But it's like a modern-ish information age, and, like, based on 0083 Stardust Memory, like, the Zeon forces knew. They knew they lost, that the Principality of Zeon had surrendered, and, like, I believe it became a republic again or something. And those forces in Africa were like, nah, we're gonna keep fighting and we're gonna wait. And that's what 83 is like, now's our moment. Like, the forces in space have this plan, like, we're gonna help them. We're gonna do this, like, for whatever, like, remnants of pride we have in Zeon.
Yeah.
Even though, like, the nation had lost and had surrendered, but they just, like, couldn't give it up. So I get that. I get why those soldiers are doing it. I don't see how Solari becomes one of them, or like, the show just didn't, to me, portray it in a way that was believable that she becomes one of those soldiers, because she's got a son. If she found out that her son had died at some point, like, that, hey, like, Solari, like, there was an attack on a colony and your son is dead, then I get it. Like, yeah, vengeance. You got nothing to live for. You have everything to live for at the end of this. I'm just, I don't know. I'm getting very animated because I'm upset by this.
No, I think it's totally legitimate.
And if you're like, oh, like, well, then the writer succeeded, I'd be like, well, then I don't want to watch this.
That's fair. That is totally fair.
If that's what you consider success.
I guess for me, the only counterpoint I would say is that I felt like they established a maternal relationship between her and LaShawn, and that and that she definitely, not in a, like, actually his mother, but, like, she's his commanding officer. He kind of, like, turns to her when he's not sure what to do, and, like, I feel like she takes his death, especially the fact that he sacrifices himself for her, incredibly hard. And
I thought you were gonna say the Gundam pilot.
oh, I mean, I think there's some element of that too, but I think there's also a sense of like, here's my own bias maybe, because I did start watching that a day after, this horrific election that United States had, and in which a lot of us thought, look, that everyone has the information. They know that he's a convicted sexual assault person, they know that
I,
he's convicted of
okay,
having committed sexual.
let
Let me just finish this.
no, I
Good.
don't want to talk about this.
Okay, that's
All
fair.
due respect, let's stick to Gundam.
Sure.
Um,
I'll
I
I'll
do
take that
not
out.
want to talk about this.
I'll take that out. I guess my only point is, yes, I find it incredibly hard to believe that she would do that, but we see evidence of people doing things all the time when we think they have all the information they should to make the right decision, when we think that they have other things to live for, and yet they don't make that decision. So I guess that's just to why, for me, it broke my heart when she made that decision, but it felt utterly believable that she would do that.
Okay. No, I mean, I think that's something we disagree on.
That's fair.
And yeah, I don't know. My thing is that, again, like, I don't understand why they would make that direct connection to Africa
Mhm.
in like the Universal Century canon timeline.
Yeah.
Because again, fans know what happens. Fans know what those people do.
Yeah.
And what happens with her, presumably. And so, like, if it was just like she stays on Earth and, I don't know, becomes a farmer or
Yeah.
something, like, I would still be like, why don't you just go back to your son?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, like, stays on Earth and does something other than fight.
Mhm.
Like, actually do something to help kids, which is presumed like what she's telling us,
Right.
right? But her motivations, to me, do not line up with her actions in any kind
Mhm.
of consistent, believable way. Like, you can say, like she's kind of lost in grief,
Right.
lost in revenge, right? Like Requiem for Vengeance.
Mhm.
But I just don't understand what she's being so vengeful over. Again, like,
Mhm.
if her son had died, like, yes, like, emotions would overwhelm her, like, and I did not see the same thing you did with LaShawn.
Yeah. That's fair.
Maybe with the Gundam pilot, because it's like he's the same age as my son is, type of thing.
Right.
But they didn't really draw that out enough, in my
Mhm.
opinion.
Yeah, I think it was rushed, to be sure. Let me ask you this. Let's say there was an addendum in which we saw her going to Africa for that reason, but then when it gets to the point that maybe she's asked to be part of this mission to go steal the nuclear bomb, and she knows what's going to happen with it, Operation Stardust, and that's her breaking point, and that's where she's like, no, we've gone too far, we've become the thing we hate, I'm not going to be a part of this. Would that change it for you?
I don't know, because, like, already what this show is doing, I disagree
Mhm.
with on like such a broad level.
Right.
Um, so like, I'm gonna get into this part where Gundam having the Gundam as the enemy in this
Yeah.
show, I thought visually worked really well. I liked that. I don't like it as an introduction for people who are unfamiliar with Gundam, as you were going into this, right? And
Yeah.
you had questions of, like, who are the good guys, who are the bad guys. To do that as an introduction in a franchise where it is like 95% clear
Mhm.
that Xeon are the bad guys, and the Federation, or at least Gundams, are the good guys. Like, we
Mhm.
can get into governments and stuff, but Gundams are, like, always the protagonist, right,
Yeah.
of these shows. And so, like, it's an interesting thing to do, like, the subversion. I do not. I do not like subversion as introduction, because now
That's fair.
you are introducing people to a world where your first impression is Xeon are the good guys. And then if you go in with that mindset and learn more, like, yeah, maybe you shift a little, but you always have that start where you're like, but Xeon, like, man, Xeon.
Oh,
And
I guess maybe that I think that's maybe what I haven't fully explained. I thought the show was very clear that Xeon are not the good guys, that these
oh,
people are
okay.
wrong. That if I haven't made that clear, let me really reemphasize that. That's what I think, that the show is showing. It's a villain origin story. It's 100% a villain origin story.
All right, fair,
Is a
fair.
And so maybe it's kind of like, the people who grow up loving Anakin, and maybe you're right that a lot of, in the same way that some people are like, no, Anakin was right, it wasn't his fault, and I'm like, wow, you missed the point. It's possible. I'd be curious for other people to write in and tell me, like, did you think Xeon was the good guys? Because, like, one of the first things I noticed is that the Gundams, the face of the robot is fairly human. It has two eyes. It has what looks kind of like the impression of like a face.
Yeah.
The Zekas,
Zaku.
the Zaku, thank you, are just kind of like this head with like a light going back and forth where its eye would be. That looks very robotic and looks, frankly, a lot like the Cylons from Battlestar Galactica. I think timing wise, this may have come first. I'm not sure. The original series of Battlestar
It would have
Galactica.
been real close, yeah.
Yeah, but certainly by, I think, episode 3 or 4, I think if you're watching the show and are thinking that Xeon are good guys, you've completely missed the point. Because I thought the show was really hammering home, these people think they're the good guys, but they're wrong, and that's the whole point.
But I will point out, and I'm not meaning like this is a gotcha, but even in this episode, in this discussion, earlier you referred to the Xeon group as the heroes. And that could just be habit.
Mhm.
But I like it. It's important to be clear, like they're the protagonists of the show. We had this discussion with Watchmen.
Right.
Like they're the protagonists of the show, but they're not heroes, or like they're the main characters, but they're
Yeah.
not protagonists. I don't know like where we want to draw these distinctions, but
Yeah, and
but
go ahead. I'm sorry. Continue.
but again, like I have this problem when it's the introduction, because I'm also familiar with Gundam fandom, and there's
Mm,
lots of people who, even with like knowing all of the history, are like, yeah, Xeon, like they're cool. And I have to say this.
right.
In addition to all of the uniform and flag imagery, um, the Xeon forces have a salute
Mm,
that in Japanese is Jikujion, which translates to seek Xeon. Like it is literally a
mm,
translation of German. And
right.
it's like it just doesn't get more clear than that. And the fact that they don't use this salute in this show, I think, like is deliberate and a very good thing.
Yeah.
But it's part of the military, tradition of this army. And it's deeply problematic. Like to have that in this media and fandom, that people jokingly use that salute.
Yeah, and just to further again, it's not even just the German's words; it's that the Sieg Heil was the sort of what it's kind of like the hoorah or whatever for American military. That's what you said, and it would often be immediately followed with Heil Hitler.
Yeah.
So it's that's important. And I like, if you'd ended with her joining the Africa group and one of the, her meeting the rest of them and they say Sieg Xeon, like that, I think would have hit people a lot harder. And
Yeah.
you're right, it's interesting because what I'm thinking about as we discuss this is how recent Star Wars properties, particularly Andor, have given us the stories of people in the Empire who they've humanized.
Mhm.
And a lot of people hated that and said, no, don't do this. The Empire is supposed to just be awful, particularly because there are people out there who's like, maybe the Empire had a point. Vader was cool. So I think he's right. And maybe I love it because of the way I loved those characters, because I loved learning. I don't believe that with the exception of a very small minority, that most of the enemies that we fight against, most of the people who want to do terrible things, are rubbing their hands and saying, "Mwahaha, ultimate power." I believe most of them think that they are right. And I think there's a real danger in telling a story from the perspective of the villain. And the story in which the story is saying that the villain is a hero because they think they're the hero. And like, I'll give an example. I think there's an argument to be made that the Joker movie was trying to do something similar to what, like, I think this show was doing, of like showing you the perspective of the Joker as though he thinks he's the hero, but you're supposed to realize by the end, or if through the whole thing, he's wrong. But millions of fans didn't get that. And there was a lot of really problematic parts of fandom that were really all about, no, the Joker was right. That's the whole point of this movie. And so I totally get that. And I'm curious to hear from other people who watch the show. Where do you come out on it? Because I definitely, as you're saying more, I don't have the reaction you do, but I can very much understand why you have that, particularly given like the larger context of there are lots of people who want to see Xeon as the good guy because a lot of people like authoritarianism these days. And that's a growing trend around the world, as we're seeing in all sorts of ways. So yeah, that does help me to really contextualize like where you're coming from with this and why we see it so differently.
Yeah, and for me, like I grew up with Gundam. I love the mobile suit designs
Mm-hmm.
of the Xeon by and large. I think Gundam is kind of tacky. Like
Yeah.
Gundam, the mobile suit is kind of tacky, and I love the design of Xeon mobile suits. I love some of the characters,
Mm.
but they are evil, fascist terrorists, right? Like,
Right.
and it's similar to like Darth Vader. I can
Yeah.
love his character design, James Earl Jones's voice, rest in peace,
Mm-hmm.
and all of these aspects in the watching a fiction. But it gets complicated when you, as a fan, reach the point of doing a military salute
Mm.
that has like such direct echoes to historical evil.
Yeah. No, that's horrifying.
And like the uniforms as well. Like I read a story about there was like some anime convention and a bunch of fans dressed in like authentic Xeon uniforms, but they look Nazi. These
Mm-hmm.
fans went to like a Holocaust remembrance
Oh,
museum or
Jesus
something
Christ.
like that, and then stood in front of it and then did Sieg Xeon in front of it. That's disgusting.
Yeah.
Absolutely disgusting. Like, so you have to draw the lines in fandom,
Mm-hmm.
right? That's the problem I have with the show, is that like it's trying to be really complex. I agree, and I think there are good aspects to that. Not as an
Yeah.
introduction, because I think as an introduction to Gundam, you just got to have like a basic Gundam like is the hero mobile suit story and be
Mm.
like, This is cool."
Yeah.
Story. Like there are complex Gundam stories. I love there's a story called War in the Pocket,
Mm-hmm.
where one of the main characters is a Xeon pilot,
Yeah.
and he befriends a young kid in a colony, and they like, it is a heartwarming tale. And
Mm-hmm.
it's like, okay, well, Riki, like how do you like reckon that with this, right? Like, but they tell it in a way where he's like a young pilot, he's like fairly new, like they show that, and he is not he's just a soldier. He's not part of the bigger context. And I'm not saying
Right.
that as an excuse, but as a storytelling device.
Yeah.
Here, like Solari, she's a captain. She's a veteran. They mention a battle, the Battle of Loom,
Mm-hmm.
and so like there's kind of an implied history to her, and
Right.
it's like, well, like did she participate in the gassing? Like she probably knows about the colony drop, and like what does she think about it? And
Yeah.
then to have her at the end like go to Africa and participate in what we know. I was like,
Mm.
no, not like this, Gundam. Like,
Yeah.
don't do sympathetic, Xeon like this, please. Is my opinion.
I mean, I guess what I think about when you say that she knows about the colony drop, where my mind originally
I mean,
goes,
everyone should know about it.
well,
Like,
right,
I
yeah.
don't think you can hide that.
is to the book that I think I think you've talked about loving as well, Lost Stars, which is all about these young Imperial pilots and
In Star Wars, yeah,
right and
in the Death Star.
and there are some of them who find a way. They're clearly upset about the destruction of Alderaan, but they're fed propaganda and they're able to
Yeah,
justify it to themselves. And I
yeah,
think that's to me
sure.
how that's what I think of as how a Solari could justify it to herself. I think
It
she's wrong.
and
Very clear.
I think if you want if you want this character to be that, I you have to acknowledge it, I think.
Hmm.
Like the colony drop, like it happens throughout Gundam, but this specific colony drop is like so central to the story of the 1 Year War. Like, yeah, I
Right.
think you if you want to have this character Solari, you have to mention it. Like maybe have the doctor
Right.
he's like UMRC, which I think is supposed to invoke Red Cross. They never say Red Cross, but the
Right.
initials. Um, have him at he travels. He's like a neutral doctor, like Red
Right.
Cross, but he travels with the Xeon forces. And I think he does have an interesting like moral discussion with one of them about like you
Yeah.
shouldn't have killed them, and the soldiers like it's us or them type of thing.
Right.
But have him say like at the campfire be like, what, how can you guys fight for Xeon like when they drop this colony, blah blah blah,
Yeah.
like something, conversation like that, which would introduce more people to the history of Gundam and to the
Right.
interesting ambiguities of morality here, like of fighting, like who you're fighting for and what they're doing.
See, I think a lot of this comes down to whether my reaction is typical or not, because
Yeah, and that's why I didn't want to tell you too much before we started
no,
recording and like
I,
introduce to you and say like, well, you don't know about this, which is not like a
right.
criticism of you, like,
No, of
but to
course.
say like this is the context of where this show exists in Gundam.
And I guess just what I want to convey is what you are saying for me, and it may well be that I'm the outlier, and I'd be very curious how other fans who've just seen the show feel about all this. For me, this is the perfect introduction to everything you're
Okay.
talking about, because I am like, when you tell me that the Xeon I saw in this also did these like horrific acts, it
Yeah.
doesn't surprise me at all. It just like, I have a feeling of like, oh, now I'm seeing more of the context, and I love that. And not love it like, oh, it's so cool, but in the like, yeah, okay, I was right that the Xeons were wrong, and like it and I think you're right. Like, I think if the show had started in the 70s with this, and then you'd pull back, people would be like, whoa, why'd you start with the bad guys? That doesn't make any sense. For me, and I think this is part of how things have changed somewhat since the 70s, and certainly not everyone agrees with me. But if you tell me that an oppressed colony does terrible things to the oppressor colonizer, I'm immediately going to jump to, I don't care how bad they were. If you don't want them doing bad things, don't oppress them. And that's very much
Mm.
to say I don't care is false. I do care, and I don't want them to do that, and that is very true of the situations today. But also sort of like, it's going to be hard to get me to say that the colony fighting oppression is the bad guy, because I'm going to be like, yeah, Saw Gerrera did terrible things, Lucen did terrible things. It didn't make the fight against the Empire wrong. But if you instead show me the fight and show me that actually, no matter how bad the oppression was in the beginning, they're so focused on vengeance now that they're the real enemy. I'm like, okay, now I get this in a way that, so I don't know, maybe it's just kind of like you got introduced to it at a very different time. And for me getting introduced to it this time, this is the introduction I need. But I want to look more at fandom, because you're right. If a whole bunch of people are watching the show and then finding the pro Xeon people and being like, yeah, you're right, Solari was great, then I'm completely wrong and you're completely right.
Yeah, I think the problem is that again we have like such an extensive history.
Mhm.
To me, like is clear, like the way that Gundam has been written is clear, and there are interesting moral ambiguities and sympathetic elements and sympathetic like individual characters that you can
Yeah.
create on the side of Xeon and write interesting stories. But when you get down to it, like the government or the military committed war crimes,
Yeah.
right? Like, and there's there's probably things that the Federation did that are bad, like because
Hmm.
that's war. Like we talk about war in that context, but like the colony drop is like such a red line for me.
Right.
Like it is one of the most horrific things you can do, right? Like and there's like a nuclear analogy as well to that.
Hmm.
Um, so yeah, I don't know. I think if you're interested in follow up, I don't know where you can watch it currently, but 0080 War in the Pocket is like to
Hmm.
me one of the best Gundam stories and an interesting sympathetic Xeon soldier story.
Okay. Yeah, I'll definitely
Um,
check it out. But I'd like to just start with some of the more original stuff, and it might just be reading Wikipedia or watching the original anime, and see where it goes. And I'll just add one last thing, and then we can kind of wrap up. We'll do a quick bonus section on child soldiers. But we're gonna keep it pretty short because it's already been a long episode. And Ricky, I thank you so much because as you say more, I can very much understand why my perspective is incredibly upsetting because there's all this stuff that I don't know, and so I really appreciate you being able to stick with it and help educate me and help me better understand all of this.
no, and I
Um,
want to say, like, I appreciate your perspective on this because that's what I
mm,
wanted. I wanted to
yeah,
hear from someone who doesn't, know the first thing about Gundam really, and
yeah,
what impression this left on you, and that's important.
yeah. No, I get
And
that.
I want people to be careful because we talk a lot about impressions of media, and
Yeah.
in this day and age, like you can get lost in rabbit holes and pipelines. And I
Hmm.
do think like, and we'll have more like follow-up episodes on this, right? Like with Full Metal Alchemist,
Yep.
that I do believe that there are probably dangerous pipelines that go
Yeah.
from I'm willing to say uh, seek Xeon and do this anime salute to hey, like if you're interested in that, let
Right.
me tell you about other things that are cool, quote
Yeah. Because
unquote
like
cool on the same vein.
you don't go to a Holocaust memorial and do that unless you've been sucked into some very anti-Semitic wormholes, and I
Yeah,
can very much see
that's
that as being a problem there. The last just one line I want to quote because I think like for me this was one of the things that like from the very beginning had me questioning Xeon. Um,
okay.
you know, I don't think a moral war is really a possibility. I'm very much against like just war theory. I understand the need to fight against oppression, but I think beyond that, like war is generally just an awful thing. And even in a fight against oppression, I think it's never going to be good and pure and right. And again, that's exactly what we talked about in the Star Wars episode we just had. But I like one of the definitions of war crime that I've always understood is that a soldier is not supposed to lose their individual conscience, and that when you know even when given an order to massacre civilians, if you follow that order you're committing a war crime. And like, yes, the higher punishment's going to be for the person who ordered you to, but you're supposed to know better, to know to not obey that order. And again, I haven't been in the military. I'm saying that kind of blithely, as though it's an easy thing to do. It's obviously incredibly complicated, but I feel like that is kind of a benchmark of morality. And so early in the show, I'm pretty sure in the first episode, maybe the second, and they're talking to the doctor about, and he's saying, at one point, one of them is saying, like, so how do you guys decide who the enemy is? And one of the members of Solari's squad says, look, my higher ups tell me who the enemy is.
Mm.
And the exact quote is, they point, I shoot.
Yeah.
And that was so chilling to me. That was
Yeah.
such a clear hit me over the head with these are not good guys. Maybe they're
Okay.
fighting in a war that at one point had some good motivation or even still does. But to use the Star Wars analogies that I love so much, this is the dark side. These are people who are on the dark side now, who
Mhm.
have forgotten the idea that they're fighting, that they've lost their humanity. So yeah, that and again, maybe a lot of other people are like, oh, that's a cool line. I like that. If so, then yeah, the show was nowhere near as good as getting its message across. But to me, that was such a hit you over the head with these are, and again, I think you're right. I did use the word heroes, meaning that what I meant was that the show introduces them as though they're the heroes,
Yeah,
and then
yeah.
it's pulling the rug out from under us. And I
But
think that line was the first real tug at that rug.
no, that's fair.
So All right. Well, listeners, please let us know what you think. We'd love to hear from you, especially either if you've watched all the other shows or if you haven't watched the show or if you've no idea what any of this is, you're just listening to us. Let us know what you think.
Yeah,
It's
this is
funny.
one I would really love to hear from listeners on, especially if you, like Matthew, are not very versed in Gundam or at
Yeah.
all, and you watch this and you listen to this, and did you have the same impressions as Matthew or myself? Like, did this discussion change your mind? Like, how do you feel about this? Because
Yeah.
I think this is, again, I didn't like it. I'm gonna say that, like, I didn't like this show, like, from
That's
aesthetic
fair.
point of view. I didn't like it from a as a Gundam fan because of what it
Hmm.
was doing with the time where it was in the timeline and all that. But I was like, I think we have to talk about this because of
No,
this.
definitely.
And I really enjoyed this discussion. I want to thank you for like giving me your perspective on this, and I think
Yeah.
it helps me a lot.
Well, I'm glad, and I appreciate. 'Cause it's funny. This episode wound up being about things totally different than what I thought it was going to be about. And I think that's because you didn't pre-warn me, and I really appreciate that because I feel like the discussion we wound up having is a larger discussion that I think movies like Joker and other things like it, Fight Club, raise for us, which is that if you're making media where the idea is that the protagonist is not the hero and you want the audience to figure that out, how direct you need to be. Because like I believe that the people who made Joker weren't attending to valorize him. But I think
Mhm.
the fact that so many people walked away thinking it is a failure of the writers and the movie. And like you said, if people watch this and walk away thinking Xeon is pretty cool, then to quote you, I think you're right. The show has failed. And I
Yeah,
think we got into that, but I think there's an interesting larger discussion about what's your responsibility as a filmmaker, as a writer, as a creator, if you're trying to do something that where the protagonist is actually not the hero they think they are, what's your responsibility to really make that clear?
yeah, it's a hard one because like
Yeah.
the Joker, even like no one is confused about the Joker. Like we all know who the Joker is as a character, right?
Hmm.
From all the movies, like comic books, even if you don't watch them, like you know, just from existing in this media environment, right? Who the Joker is. Like, oh, he's a Batman villain and he's kind of
Right.
crazy clown. If that's all you know, yeah, even still,
Yeah.
that movie can do that, like that, and that's why I was like, I don't like this as an introduction, right? The Joker movie is not an introduction to the Joker for anyone, I believe.
Yeah.
Um, but this like very much is, in my opinion, and that's why I was like very uncomfortable.
Yeah. No, that I think it's really fair. And I think that's because just like there are lots of people, as you said, walking around going, even before this, saying, yeah, we love Xeon, Sieg Xeon. There are lots of people who watch that movie and it's like, oh, the Joker was right all along.
Hmm.
And I think that's dangerous and bad. So yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. I have to add one more thing. Like
Please
I
do.
kept thinking about this throughout the episode,
Hmm.
and so like the word Xeon, I think like for English speakers, you may wonder like, does this have any connection to Zion, like Zionism?
Mm,
Um, and in my research, it just does not at all. Like
yeah.
it is an unfortunate coincidence, because in Japanese it's Gion,
Mm,
and what I have ascertained is that Zionism is actually in Japanese is pronounced Shion, so it's like a very different
yeah.
uh, opening sound. So I don't think it's meant to echo that. And then like early translations of Gundam, spelled it with a J, or an X in some
Right.
cases. Like it because translations like until you reach a certain point in history like aren't consistent for these
Right.
types of things. And at some point they landed on Zeon,
Right.
which more closely echoes Zionism, but I don't think it was there
Yeah.
initially.
I think that's really helpful. And to me, I'll add the reverse context of, and again, I'm not a Hebrew scholar by any means, but like Zion is a translation of a Hebrew word that has at times been pronounced closer to it starting with an S, more like
Oh,
Zion.
okay.
And that the actual translation is probably like if you hear someone speak it who understands Hebrew, the word they're going to use is kind of between a Z and an S. It's not
Okay.
Zion. It's more Sion. Like I'm
So
not saying
the
it properly.
so the Japanese pronunciation of it, Shion, may be a more closely direct to that then.
Yeah, or at least because what I imagine is like the Japanese probably got it from Portuguese or English or
Yeah.
another who are
Yeah.
also doing their version of the Hebrew translation. It makes total sense. Yeah.
Yeah. It's fun. It's funny, like small tangent, but Japanese, like when they take foreign words and use them
Mhm.
like that, because like Germany in Japanese
Right.
is Deutsch, which is Deutsch, right?
Right.
Like so it's so I find that interesting. Anyway,
Yeah,
let's move
for sure.
on.
No, no. I mean, I'll just add the reverse also happening of how like we could call the city of Beijing Peking, but
Ah,
it just
yeah, yeah, yeah.
it comes through all these things. All right. Anyway, this has been fantastic. Thank you all to our members. Stick around. You're gonna get bonus content. If you're not a member, $5 a month, $55 a year. Also, another great way to support us is that we've talked about a number of things. I'm going to put up links for where you can watch these things or buy these things. For books, I'm going to use used bookstore. Bookstore.org, which is a way to buy them from local bookstores. For the films and stuff like that, the only way I have right now is to get through Amazon, but of course there are other ways as well. But if you want to go through Amazon, if you use any of those links, you're going to help support the podcast as well. Help us keep the lights on, help us continue the work we're doing. Think about that. Think about becoming a member. But for everyone else, most importantly, I just really want to know what y'all think. All the information is in the show notes. It's also on the website. If you go to theethicalpanda.com, that'll tell you to our email, our Facebook, our Twitter, TikTok, etc. If there's some other way you want to contact us, let us know, and I'll make sure to find a way to make that happen. And also, if you want if you want to tell us something basically on background, like you don't want to be quoted, you don't want your name mentioned, but you just want to give like something that we can have is like, hey, so people are saying this, feel free to do that. Or just say, hey, I'm fine with you quoting us and send an email, and then I'm fine to do that. So please let us know what you think. Members, stick around. We'll have more content for you in just a few moments. For everybody else, we have spoken. All right. So let's keep this pretty short. This has already gone very long. For me, granted, the Gundam pilot was never the point of view character. Everyone else in the show was adult, and the show felt very adult in that regard. Not like R-rated, but like there were more coarse words, but just like we weren't worried about like, is the kid going to be able to do his homework in time to also come and pilot the Gundam, or like who's he going to ask to the high school dance, that kind of a thing. How do you feel in the Gundam shows? I'm guessing there is more of that kind of thing. How do you feel the child soldier aspect is compared in Gundam compared to something like Neon Genesis Evangelion?
Well, Gundam pilots are almost universally teenagers, I think,
Okay.
since the very beginning.
Right.
And part of it is again, like we've talked about, anime is for kids.
Yeah.
For the most part. And so you want to portray your main character piloting your awesome mecha mobile suit as a kid,
Right.
so that the kids watching can identify with that and be like, I want to pilot a Gundam. In terms of the canon history, I think part of the reason this happens is because of the whole new type, like psychic ability philosophy, that these kids are like the generation born in space. So
Right.
they have developed better and stronger new type powers because of that.
Because we're not
Versus
hundreds and hundreds of years into colonization.
no, because I think it's just like literally 80 years, right? The universal
Right.
century, I think, starts with space colonization, is my understanding. So it might even be like a couple of generations in, but like the protagonist kids like are almost always like born in space.
Okay.
Um
And does the show have that same kind of like, you have to finish your homework on time to go fight in the big battle? Like, is that same kind of like balancing of traditional high school stories with the Gundam stories?
No, not in the UC. In the UC, like Gundam Wing does that. Like they go to school and it's weird.
Yeah.
In the UC, like they're basically like conscripted,
Okay.
not directly by the government, but they literally like fall into their Gundam. Of like a fight happens near them, and it's like, oh, like I have to do something. Like this Gundam has been abandoned, type of
Yeah.
thing. Like is the original Gundam origin.
Right.
Amurode, his father actually is the designer of the Gundam, and that's why
Hmm.
it's like on their or near their property.
Yeah.
And he just like jumps into the cockpit, like reads a manual for like 2 minutes, and then is a brilliant fighter. Um,
Yeah.
New types. Um, and from that point forward, like they usually like join a ship,
Hmm.
a spaceship, and join the crew and fight, and they like fly around in space or on Earth and like fight forces, and the plot advances, etc. So there's not like a slice of life aspect to it. It is usually like right into a war, into the
Oh,
war
fascinating.
of the time. And I will say, like Gundam as a franchise is generally anti-war in
Hmm.
its portrayal. Like it's like cool fighting and all that, but almost always they portray like the tolls of war,
Yeah.
especially on the main characters and like how it traumatizes these kids.
Mm.
Zeta Gundam, which was the first sequel series, like literally the main character ends the series with PTSD and is basically like comatose.
Yeah. I can see that. Yeah. No, I think I really like that because, like, I do love the slice of life stuff. I like high school dating shows and stuff like that, and I kind of have always loved the, like, Vampire Diaries, which balances the two, and inevitably all those shows forget about the high school part and just makes them just you know young vampires, and I was kind of lose interest then. But I think it's also really fun to show the other side because you and I did a whole episode on child soldiers and how there's something really problematic about that, and how it all comes about. And so yeah, I like the idea of a show that's not like, oh yeah, these are like fun, happy kids. Like, no, these are kids who are put into a situation they're far too young to for, that often it's not by their choice, and that it has real damage, does real damage to them.
Yeah, Gundam. I mean, they often end with victory,
Hmm.
right? Like the good guys win type of thing. Like the kid protagonist defeats the enemy mobile suit in the final
Yep.
battle and wins, and that helps lead to the Federation winning that battle or that
Hmm.
war. But inevitably, yeah, it's not like a happy ending.
Yeah.
Like a lot of Gundams end with kind of like what was it all for type of things. Like we fought, like we killed all these people, like my friends died.
Right.
It's very real.
Yeah.
And that's definitely an aspect of it that I do like because, I think you and I both grew up in the 80s in the US where, GI Joe no one ever dies. And
Yeah.
it's like very fake fighting. And
Yeah.
and so like that's an aspect of Gundam that like feels very real.
Yeah.
And you can question like whether that's a good idea to have in your kids show, but it's not like it's usually not gory. Like it's kind of a trope
Yeah.
that because they're mechas. Like what will happen is they will show the pilot of the mobile suit
Hmm.
like make a yell like ah, and then
Yeah.
like it'll cut to outside and his mobile suit blows up.
Yeah.
It's like a very tropey way that people die in Gundam.
Yeah. No, I can totally see that. I can see that. All right. Well, this has been great. Riki, thank you so much for introducing me to this. I'm excited to watch more of it and to talk more about it. And listeners, mostly I'm excited to hear what you have to say. So thank you all so much. We have spoken.